Welcome to Orensha Tech's PowerShell series. In this video, we're going to go over input and output. So far, we've mostly been using PowerShell's output functions, and even then, we've mostly just been using the default functions that PowerShell gives us. But we can get a lot more precise in our control in what output we are given. There are also a lot of options that we have for giving PowerShell input, but we are going to be going over the scenario where someone is actually in front of a PowerShell host application to be able to give PowerShell that input. Now, there are options where you can feed input through scripting, but we're not going to cover that in this video, and we'll cover that in a later video. So let's go over some terminology. In PowerShell, there's the PowerShell engine, which is the part of PowerShell that takes the commandlets and processes them under the hood and then feeds those to the .NET Core or .NET Framework, depending on which PowerShell version you're using. And a host application is an intermediary between you and the PowerShell engine. So this could be the console host, which many people are familiar with, and we can take a look at that here. So this is the console host, and it's one of the ways that we can interact with the PowerShell engine. Now there's also an integrated host, and that's what we're seeing here in Visual Studio Code. Now, an integrated host can be integrated into anything. It's simply an application that builds a way for us to communicate with the PowerShell engine. And really, a host application can be anything that acts as that intermediary between something and the PowerShell engine. And another good example of this is the PowerShell worker for Azure Functions. And this is infrastructure hosted in the cloud, and all of the commands on there are run unattended. So it's not necessarily something that has to be in front of you like an application. It can be something like this scenario that's run in Azure but still communicates with the PowerShell engine. Okay, now let's go over input. And we have looked at this a little bit, but let's cover the bases here and look at the main way that we're going to receive input when we're using PowerShell with a console host or an integrated host like we have here in VS Code. So if we use the command read host, this is the command that tells the host that we want to display a text and then gather an input. So we're going to put in here, enter a username. If we run that, we can see that it puts the text here and it also appends a colon at the end. And then whatever we type here is going to be returned to us, or rather returned to the pipeline, which, since we don't have anything after this, is going to be spit right back out to us. So just like that, we typed in Orensha Tech and Orensha Tech was returned to us. Now we could always put this into a variable. So we'll do the same thing. And if we put Orensha Tech here, nothing will be returned to us because it was returned to the pipeline, which was then stored in our username variable. So now if we run the variable, it will return that input to us anytime that we want to use it. So this is a great tool if you're building scripts that require some user input, for instance, creating new users or something of that nature. This is an excellent scenario for read host. All right, let's go over output now. And first we're going to cover the command write host. Now, write host is not the best way to return something to the host application, but it's definitely something that you want to be familiar with and understand how it works. So let's use an example here. We're going to use write host with our classic hello world, and we'll see that this returns hello world to the host. But it's very interesting how write host actually works. What it does is it takes hello world and immediately sends it to the host application, and it bypasses the rest of the pipeline and whatever else may happen along the pipeline and puts that string or whatever directly to the host. Now, there are a lot of better ways that we can do this type of functionality, especially when we're looking at errors or specific types of text and information that we're getting. We definitely want to use different tools than Write Host. And really one of the only benefits of Write Host is the ability to change the foreground and background color of the text. So let's look at an example of that, because this is really the only reason that you'd want to use Write Host. So we'll put in a string called changed color, and then we'll use our foreground parameter and type in magenta. And then for our background parameter, we will use whites. So there we go. We were able to change the colors of the background and the foreground as it came to the host application. Now, this isn't something you should rely on for all host applications. And in some, the colors are not going to all be the same. And in some, it's just not going to work at all. So it's kind of cool, but definitely not something you want to rely on for a production means. Now, in PowerShell version 5, Write Host got rewritten to be a wrapper for write information. And the difference there for write information is that it gives you the ability to take this information, like changed color, and pass it to a separate information stream that is passed down the pipeline. So in that way, they were able to make Write Host backwards compatible for all uses of Write Host previous to PowerShell 5, but it also gave you extra functionality to use to pass this change color string down the pipeline further to manipulate and return in some other way rather than write to the host. But again, there are many different information streams that we can use, and Write Host is generally not going to be the one that we want to go with. So it's a good tool to have while you're beginning to learn PowerShell, but just remember there's going to be a better way rather than Write Host to achieve what you're trying to achieve. And one of those is write output. So write output is very similar to Write Host, except whatever you put in is going to be passed down the pipeline. So if we use our same hello world example, we can see it's identical to the results that we get with Write Host. However, this hello world is passed down the pipeline, and if we had more manipulation on that object, it would be beholden to that manipulation, whereas Write Host, it would not. And let's look at that to show you what I'm talking about. So we're going to pipe this into where object, and then we'll put a filter on this for anything length greater than 20. So if the length is less than 20, it will filter out that object, which in this case, hello world is less than 20 characters. So as you can see, it was not returned in the pipeline, demonstrating that this hello world string object is passed through to this next command where object. Now let's run this same thing with write host instead. So as you can see there, the exact same thing except for we used write host instead of write output. And we did get hello world here, even though it is less than the 20 character filter that we applied to the pipeline. But remember, write host takes this object here and passes it directly to the host application, which in our case is this Visual Studio Code integrated host. So it bypasses the entire pipeline that comes afterward. All right, next let's go over some of our other write options. So this first one we've got is write warning. And these are going to be the other options I was mentioning earlier that are going to give us the more specific use case of an information stream that we're looking for and that we're trying to achieve with the text that we're returning to the host. So this first one is write warning, and it is a warning text that defaults in yellow and preceded with the label warning. And here, this variable warning preference is the indicator to the shell whether we want this information stream turned on. So here we can see that the default is continue, which means that we do want anything that is passed with write warning to return to the shell. So in this next example, write verbose, this gives us additional information. The default is in yellow, and it has a label of verbose that precedes the text. And in this, the variable is verbose preference. And the default for this is silently continue. So this means that it's not going to return this to the host. And we have to manually turn this on if we want to see anything written to the verbose information stream. Similarly, this next one, write debug, it gives us debugging text defaulted in yellow text and proceeded with the label debug. The variable for this is debug preference and its default is silently continue. So we have to manually turn that one on as well. This next one is write error and this gives us error messages. The default for this one is continue, which we're all familiar with because we see that red text whenever something goes wrong. But if we do want to turn that off, the variable for this is error action preference. This next one here is write information, and this gives us informational messages. So this could be used for anything extra that we want to provide to give context to the commands that we're running. The variable for this is information preference, and the default is silently continue. And this last one here is write progress, and it displays a progress bar for a command that we run. And it works a little differently than the others. If you're curious about it, give it a Google search. I'm not going to cover that here, but it is a fun little addition to add to your commands just to see what the progress is of those commands. And that wraps up this lesson on input and output. In our next lesson, we're going to be going over improving remote commands. Until then, thanks for watching and have a good day.